So our next speaker has requested I introduce him as a professor in exile from Evergreen State College down in Washington State. So please give a warm welcome for Dr. Bret Weinstein.
Hi there. Thank you for that nice, warm welcome. It's great to see so many people who, as I understand it, are gathered because they are interested in liberty. I must say I also am quite interested in liberty, so I'm looking forward to talking to many of you and to the panel discussion that will come later. I should say I had some jokes that I was going to open up with, but somebody warned me that I should not make jokes about hockey while in Canada. So there goes the first 15 minutes of what I was planning to say. You can learn a lot from what people tell you you're not allowed to joke about in a particular location. My wife and I went on our honeymoon in Turkey, and we were told that Turks are very warm people who will talk to you about just about anything, but don't joke about Ataturk. So Ataturk if you're in Turkey, hockey if you're in Canada. These are topics to be treated carefully. All right, so the title of my talk is How the Magic Trick is Done. I have a very odd position at the moment, and that position is as somebody who is analytically fascinated by systems and the way they evolve, and at the same time, I'm at the center of an event that presumably many of you know about at Evergreen State College. So I've had the opportunity to watch this system evolve from a vantage point that few people have. And it means that my analytical side has been tracking the way such movements function and has been learning an amazing amount at a tremendous rate just by virtue of the fact that there's so much to be seen and to be discussed. Alternative title for the talk that I rejected is Evergreen is Your Future, because as much as I think what happened at Evergreen is extraordinary, I do think what it is ahead of the curve. And if we're not careful, what happened at Evergreen is going to happen everywhere, and we really ought to be careful, because as much as what took place at Evergreen was absurd and therefore in some ways potentially amusing if you weren't trapped in it, what it represents is actually quite dangerous, and I don't just mean dangerous even to the university system, which would be bad enough, but really dangerous to civilization itself, because the university system is where those who run civilization figure out how to think, and if we take the mechanisms whereby we train people how to think critically and carefully and how to discover things that are true that they don't expect or intuit, then civilization is going to lose its ability to navigate. And I must say I find that prospect absolutely frightening. So my plan is to talk a little bit about some observations. Some of these observations have a particular place in a kind of a logical progression. Other ones stand isolated, but nonetheless I think it's worth your time to have heard them from what I guess is an insider perspective, so you can recognize them when they happen in other places. So let's talk a little bit about humor. We brushed on that topic a little bit to begin with. But there's something that is decidedly humorless about the social justice warrior culture. And I must say, when I find people are humorless, it doesn't necessarily tell me that they're bad, but it does send up a warning flag. And the reason for that is because humor has a very special role to play for human civilization. We navigate gray area, nuance, the counterintuitive, that which is not what it seems. All of those things are navigated normally through humor. It's a way in which we can tread into that territory without committing ourselves fully, but investigating what's actually true. So a humorless movement is in some sense immovable. It cannot be convinced that it has something wrong, and it cannot redirect itself. And so when we look at the social justice revolution, and we find it very committed to things that are not even superficially reasonable, Part of what must have happened is its own commitment to the idea that what it already believes is sufficiently true that it does not need to redirect in any way. That commitment has kept it on a steady bearing that cannot be disrupted. Next thing to say is that some stories diagnose a system. And so the story of what happened at Evergreen happens to have diagnosed several systems, some of which we are all involved in. It certainly diagnosed the press in a way that I find most disturbing. So let's, for the moment, be overly black and white about it and dichotomize the press into the nominally left-leaning and the nominally right-leaning press. The left-leaning press, with some significant exceptions, came very late to the story and was very reluctant about reporting it to the extent it was willing to report it at all. Now, why is that so? Well, I'm afraid the answer is the story did not fit the left narrative. In fact, it said there was something wrong with the standard left narrative that needed to be understood. And so the left press, rather than figure out how to report the story, decided it would rather not report the story and maybe just wait it out, see if the story would go away. Now, if I can just be clear about what the problem was, at Evergreen, we had bigots of color. Even worse, we had black bigots of color. That is not a comfortable story for the left. It's a story the left does not like. It is a story I do not like. Nonetheless, that is what happened, and therefore, if you were to approach the Evergreen story journalistically, you would be compelled to figure out how to report that story, and to the extent that it reflected badly on the left narrative, so be it. But that wasn't the way the press works. Now, in part, we could say shame on the press, but we could also say, well, why is the press reluctant to report counterintuitive stories? For one thing, you would imagine that that would draw a certain number of people to read a counterintuitive story. Man bites dog is more interesting than dog bites man, right? So you might imagine that there'd be some draw for the left press to report a story that doesn't sound like normal. On the other hand, in a market, the press has to compete long-term against other elements of the press. And one of the things that the press, like other entities, do is it tells us things that reinforce the beliefs we already hold in order to get us to come back. And so there is some reflex there to simply reject a story in which the bigots are black. The right-leaning press did something different. The right-leaning press engaged in regular journalism. Now, I don't mean every entity on the right, but I do mean, in general, there were a number of publications that are decidedly right of center that reported the story perfectly straight. Now, you can't necessarily know that as outsiders to the story, but as somebody who knew the players of the story, could spot every error that was reported, every time the press said something that was factually incorrect, it was obvious to me and to my wife, who is also a professor at Evergreen, and it was not necessarily obvious to the public. So I can tell you which press outlets did the best job, which ones did their homework, which ones figured out who was who and what their roles were. And Campus Reform did a great job, the Weekly Standard did a great job, the Wall Street Journal did a great job. So what I'm telling you is that in this particular case, there was an outbreak of great journalism on the right because the story didn't conflict with anything that forced the right-leaning press into a contortion. Now, I don't think either right or left really has the answer at the moment. I think both right and left are a bit confused, and they're confused about different things. But this story says something about the press and its polarization and what its implications are for society. The core issue is one of narrative. There are narratives that run underneath what the press reports, either right or left. And to the extent that a story violates the core narrative, it's a problem. To the extent that it validates the core narrative, it is seen as positive. What we, as consumers of journalism, should be thinking is there's a problem that the press is built around narratives, and that it is doing any kind of analysis whatsoever that depends on a particular story matching a narrative. What we should want is a press that is non-ideological and reports the story as it is, and to the extent that it validates some narrative in the outer world, so be it. But narrative should not be driving our journalism, and yet the diagnosis of the system here is that narrative is playing a profound role in everything, but you can only see it when something causes an error. Another system that was diagnosed by this fiasco is the university system. The university system has been engaged in multiple jobs in society. It certainly plays an important role in training people to function, but it's also involved in industry, and it's involved in markets, and it is involved in politics. And all of these things have caused universities to act in a way that is counterproductive to the cause of inquiry. And that should probably be our primary take-home message here, is that inquiry is essential, and it cannot start if you know your conclusions. Inquiry, honest inquiry, is generated when you are willing to discover that your conclusions are dead wrong. The legal system also showed itself in this case. My wife and I, we did not actually reach the point of filing suit against our college because there is a 60-day waiting period, and we settled with the college before filing suit. But nonetheless, we did get to experience the Attorney General's office, and we discovered that there is actually a hazard in this social justice movement that is moving through our legal system as well. So to the extent that there are significant penalties to be paid by people who espouse heterodox perspectives, that has strong implications for what it would look like to impanel a jury. What are the chances that you're going to get 12 people who are open-minded enough to be able to deal with a story that, for example, the New York Times fumbled? I should probably say the New York Times fumbled the story in an interesting way. The op-ed page did a pretty good job. Barry Weiss and Frank Bruni both wrote excellent op-eds on the Evergreen story that told the story pretty straight, and then the news division waited 4 weeks, and it told a very comforting story for its readers that was quite at odds with the reality of what had happened. I find myself in a unique, and I hesitate to use the word privileged, position as a result of what's happened. I have paid the price to be able to tell it straight. They challenged me. They called me a racist. It turned out that stigma didn't stick in my case. I happened to be lucky enough to have a large number of people who knew it wasn't true, and there were enough elements in my past that said that simply doesn't add up, that I survived that attack. Having survived that attack, I can now just simply speak freely. And one question I want you to ask yourselves is, what do we do about the fact that most people aren't lucky enough to have a history that tells that story clearly? They are in a worse position from the point of view of defending themselves, and what we really ought to be thinking is, how are we going to arrange to make it safe for people to engage in honest inquiry and discussion? All right, now to some deeper analysis. The first thing to understand about what we are facing is that it sounds like a bunch of arguments about what is factually true. It's very confusing, though, because these arguments aren't even superficially defensible. So how can people be making arguments that are so clearly wrong and yet be surviving in the marketplace of ideas? Well, they're not really arguments. What we face is an insurgency. The insurgency is behaving tactically, not analytically. So the arguments aren't for real. Now, to be sure, there are arguments being made, but they are largely being made behind closed doors amongst participants in the insurgency. And then what we see on the outside are basically a PR campaign designed to have certain effects, but not built around deeply held beliefs. So that's very confusing until you spot that that's what you're up against. Then when you see it, you can start to realize that the arguments being leveled at you can't be answered because there's nothing you could possibly say that would cause those listening to you to pivot. How do we know this? Well, first of all, a lot is said online if you know where to look. So you will find people within the movement describing their relative roles and explaining why it is that certain people should behave this way and that way. And if you listen in, you can figure out what the rules of the game are. But you can also spot that there is a system of things that if one accepts them cannot be escaped. So for example, there are linguistic traps, and there are many of them. So a linguistic trap involves something like the redefinition of a word, like racism or white supremacy. So the word gets redefined, and it gets redefined in a way that sets the bar incredibly low, so that really you can't help but trip over it. Having tripped over it, the penalty phase takes the definition right back to its traditional one. So if you turn out to be a white supremacist because you have failed to properly confront a system that has been deemed guilty of white supremacy, then the penalty for white supremacy is as if you have burned a cross on someone's lawn, right? That is unfair and logically inconsistent, but nonetheless very effective. Nobody wants to be declared a white supremacist. There are many of these traps, and they are distributed around the landscape, such that if you try to just simply navigate by intuition, you can't help but run afoul of them. The other thing that you'll find are Trojan horse proposals. So these are policy proposals that superficially seem all right, but the details of them, which are a little bit often hard to ferret out, are very dangerous. So Evergreen's meltdown surrounded something called the Strategic Equity Plan. Now, the Strategic Equity Plan was, I will never know for sure if it was intentional, but it was written in such a dull fashion, such a dry manner, that nobody could possibly want to read it. You really had to force yourself to take your medicine. But having read it, it included all kinds of plans to restructure the college that were not only unfair and unwise, but put the college in danger of fiscal insolvency. What I really got in trouble for was not the day of absence and my objection to it. What I really got in trouble for was my opposition to the strategic equity proposal on the basis that it wasn't a smart thing for the college to sign up for. That was unforgivable, and it caused a number of people to believe that I needed to be driven out of the college, otherwise I was going to be the lone obstacle to that proposal. Mind you, most of the people pushing that proposal have not read it, I guarantee you that. I think many of the people whose names are on it had not read it. The number of errors in the document when it was first released was so great that it is impossible that all of those people had gone through it and not spotted them, for one thing. All right, the arguments are not real. There are linguistic traps, there are Trojan horse proposals, and there is a great deal of leverage being wielded by driving one's costs. So that is to say, there is a system of making you pay a high penalty if you do something like challenge the strategic equity proposal in public. Driving one's costs does not necessarily require you to be guilty of anything. It can be done in many different ways, and it is something to pay attention to. It is a hallmark of a conscious strategic actor that they will drive your costs up in order to disincentivize your saying things that they don't really care if you believe. They just don't want you voicing them. They don't want these objections to spread. All right, the insurgency cheats. It reworks the world to avail itself of tools that we reserve for self-defense. So when I say self-defense, some circuit in your mind goes off because you know that if you are defending yourselves, you're entitled to do things that you would not, under ordinary circumstances, be entitled to do. You cannot kill somebody unless you are acting in self-defense, and then you absolutely can, and you'll walk away scot-free. So self-defense is a very powerful concept. If you are engaged in self-defense, you are entitled to do things that you are not allowed to do otherwise. Much of the language surrounding the social justice revolution is phrased in terms of self-defense. They say that speech is violence. Well, who is it violence against? Well, it's violence against those who are historically oppressed. And what does it mean? Well, it means they are entitled to avail themselves of tools that they would not otherwise be allowed to utilize, right? That's a simple sleight of hand. By causing speech to be violence, you avail yourself of violent tools in response very often. That's what the Antifa is doing, right? They are engaged in actual physical violence against people espousing what are sometimes bad ideas, but not always. It labels people to delegitimize them. So I've met many interesting characters since May. when things melted down at Evergreen. One thing I've met a great many of are people who believe themselves to be progressive and on the left, but have been described publicly as on the right. Now, this has happened to me, so I know it's funny, right? The idea that I'm on the right is preposterous because I'm a lifelong progressive, and my position on this hasn't changed as a result of my experiences at Evergreen. Now, that said, many of the policy proposals that the left favors, I am skeptical of, but nonetheless, my values, if we were to sit down and talk about it, you'd discover that I am indeed a true progressive. But these other folks I've met, I have very often encountered them online before I meet them in person. I met the folks from Spiked Online the other day. Their Wikipedia page describes them as libertarian. I mentioned this to them, and they bridled at this description. They said, don't read the Wikipedia page. It gets us all wrong. We're actually progressives, and they went into their bona fides. So many of the people are now orphaned, effectively, by being shoved out of the left nominally and into some kind of no man's land, right? They are deemed to be right, or if you do something that really annoys people, you will be deemed to be alt-right. And the threshold for being alt-right is a bar that, again, has been set so low you couldn't help but trip over it. So, for example, one of the favorite tropes of people in the social justice movement is to declare you alt-right because somebody made an alt-right comment under a YouTube video you posted and you didn't delete it, right? That's a heck of a standard, but nonetheless, I've seen it happen multiple times. We had the group Patriot Prayer come to Evergreen. Actually, oddly, they came to defend my free speech rights. They were described by faculty members as Nazis from Portland. That was the literal description of them. This description makes little sense. I'm Jewish. Nazis, unless they were deeply confused, would be unlikely to come defend my free speech rights. But nonetheless, these folks came and they gave some speeches outside the campus, and my wife and I watched them live streamed. The speech was conspicuous, also inconsistent with being a Nazi. They were extremely tolerant of people from different racial groups. They espoused tolerance for trans people, for gay people. They seemed to be very much in favor of free expression. None of this made any sense. Weeks later, when Patriot Prayer showed up in Berkeley and were attacked again by the Antifa, the Weekly Standard ran an expose on Patriot Prayer. And it turned out that Patriot Prayer was headed by a guy who is actually half Japanese. His right-hand man is Samoan. These people aren't remotely racist. They are interested in tolerance. They are Trump supporters, it's true, but lukewarm on him. In other words, the whole idea that they were Nazis from Portland was cooked up to dismiss them so that nobody would listen to them. That was the idea, and it didn't matter that they were slandered in the process. All right. There are two kinds of people within the social justice movement. You can't necessarily tell them apart because the current system, the current circumstances make them sound alike. The first group, by far the much larger group and the much more difficult one for people like me to figure out what to do with, are people who are actually against oppression. I am against oppression, so ordinarily I would think these would be my natural allies, but yet they attack me. The second group inside the movement are people who wish to turn the tables of oppression. Those would be my enemies. The fact is, though, the ones who wish to confront oppression and to undo it don't realize what they've signed up for. Many of the prime movers in the movement are actually bad actors who have not shared the plan with the rank and file of the movement. So many of the people inside the movement are well-intentioned, but not skeptical enough and have fallen into something unholy. The allies tend to sign on based on what I would call the label on the box. So there's a box and it says equity on it, and then people are asked, well, are you in favor of racial equity? Most people would answer yes. Okay, you're with us. But what's in the box is not actually equity. And so one finds, if you sign up based on the label of the box, that you've signed up for something that you didn't bargain for. There's another reason that allies sign on with the bad actors who are driving the social justice movement, and that is out of fear of being targeted themselves. So we have a very dangerous movement. It's proven that it has the power to harm people, and many people who fear that it might come for them, that it might ferret out some kind of hidden white supremacy in their minds or something, sign up in an effort to demonstrate that they are good people so that the movement does not come after them. We also have what I would call marginal coalition members who have signed up in an effort to get ahead for fear that they will be shunted onto the other side. So the coalition is built from intersectionality, a term you've no doubt all heard, where one's rank within some sort of future idealized state is based on how much historical oppression you have faced based on which populations you belong to and what their history has been. Now, I will point out that even if we accept intersectionality on its own terms, it is completely incoherent. So, for example, as a Jewish person in the United States, I have not experienced too much oppression myself. That said, if intersectionality is good to its word, then the fact that my ancestors experienced literally thousands of years of consistent oppression ought to count in my favor with respect to whether or not I have the right to an opinion, whether I have the right to help shape the movement. But no, in fact, for some reason, my Judaism counts against me. I can't fathom why, except for the fact that really it's a self-serving ideology that chooses to highlight certain facts and to de-emphasize others. So coalition members are prioritized based on how many different categories of historical oppression they can claim apply to them, which means that there are a certain number of groups that have only a small number of these oppression points. On our campus, people who are simply gay have only one oppression point, and so they have to work extra hard in order to remain in the good graces of the movement. The same thing goes for people who are simply women. Also Asians. Now, I'm not making this up, and I'm not even inferring it. The fact is, during the day of absence, there were seminars on how Asians are part of the problem when it comes to white supremacy. I mean, you can't even really make this stuff up. It's that preposterous. So, in any case, my point would be, you can imagine if you have some dangerous force wielding the power over your ability to do your job or to be hired, or the likelihood that you will be fired, if that group is wielding that kind of power and you happen to be on the border of its good graces, some fraction of people will choose to behave in a way that advertises that they are signed up for this plan, whatever it is, in hopes of just simply getting out of the way of it. Universities and colleges are now at the epicenter of this fight. Many of us who have been involved deeply in making university and college culture find this very odd. Is it really true that we have a terrible problem with racism on college campuses today? Is that really what we're to infer from this? I think it's very much the wrong conclusion. What's happening is there are deep problems with equality, and they're very uncomfortable to navigate. But the colleges and universities are being attacked not because they are the epicenter of this. In fact, they are the most progressive places that we have. They are the places that are most likely to recognize historical oppression and to realize that it has important implications for how well people do in life. But what they are is soft targets. They're soft targets, and because they're listening, they are easy to manipulate. Were it the objective of this social justice movement to confront the much more difficult problems and to confront them at the full level of nuance, I would be interested in seeing those problems addressed. But I cannot sign up with a movement that is attacking those people who have come the greatest distance toward creating an equitable situation. Okay, so what is it that this movement is actually trying to achieve? Now remember, I'm arguing that there are actually two groups embedded in one movement. One of those groups is really hoping to achieve some kind of equality. Hopefully they're pursuing equality of opportunity, not equality of result, but nonetheless, equality is something I would guess everybody in the room here would sign up for as an ideal that would be worth pursuing. But then there's the other faction. The faction that I'm arguing is actually driving the agenda of the movement. What do they want? Well, it's very uncomfortable, and in fact, I got into big trouble for tweeting that the movement at Evergreen was actually involved in achieving black supremacy. Now, it's interesting. I must have been challenged 20 times over having used the term black supremacy. Not once did anybody tell me that that was not what they had seen unfolding during the protests at Evergreen. They told me effectively that that was an impolite term for it. But we had all seen it. We had all seen the circumstance where people would walk into a room and they would say, the food, the chairs, the water, that's not for white people. If you're a white person, stand in the back, don't sit in the chairs, don't eat the food. This was actually said out loud. So in some sense, it's undeniable that what was being pursued was a kind of supremacy. My feeling is I'm against any kind of supremacy. I would like to see everybody have access to the means to get ahead through achievement. I don't want to see any population advantaged and any population disadvantaged. So I'm anti-supremacy, and that means that I have to be offended. If I'm to be consistent with that principle, I have to be offended when any population seeks supremacy over everybody else. Nonetheless, we find ourselves trapped in a situation where we can't even use the terms that naturally apply. What they've advocated on a more narrow level is, if we were to analyze it honestly, it is a program of radical reparations. And when I say radical reparations, reparations is a controversial concept. I can't say that I'm even necessarily against it if it were wisely done, although I'm pretty sure that simple payments are not a good idea. But nonetheless, I can imagine a good argument for the idea that some populations have been systematically disadvantaged and that the correct remedy for that is to provide some kind of help, systematic help. Now, if it were me writing the script, I would say investment in those communities would be the right way to go. But nonetheless, reasonable people can disagree over what the right way to view a reparations argument is. I don't think reasonable people can disagree over the following question. Is it okay to set up a reparations program in your classroom, right? Are you allowed to transfer the educational well-being of one group of your students to another group of your students? I can't see a reasonable argument for that, and yet I know that that is what is unfolding in classrooms today on the basis that it is clearly the right thing from some people's perspective. The so-called progressive stack, in which students are called upon in reverse order of their historical privilege, is preposterous. For one thing, you know nothing about the individual histories of the students there. I've had white students who have spent years eating roadkill because their families didn't have enough to eat. That student is not somehow so emboldened by a history of privilege that they should wait to ask their question. Questions should be asked by people who have them, and any professor who sidelines students because they're black or they're gay is a problem. Any professor who sidelines students because they're white is a problem. This is just simply what real equity would look like. But nonetheless, we are effectively told that within institutions and within classrooms that effectively a forced unacknowledged campaign of reparations is the right solution. So critical race theory is the intellectual home of much of the foundation of the social justice movement. Critical race theory is where intersectionality emerged from. But it has become something of a con game. It has become a place that one can justify illogical things and then move them into the policy layer without having to explain oneself. My brother, Eric Weinstein, has coined the phrase the intersectional shakedown, that effectively people are being relieved of their well-being on the basis that there's some justification for doing so. And it's not only, it is simply immoral, and we have to confront it. Many players that you will find signed up for the current social justice agenda are actually involved in the racket as free agents. They are serving their own interests at public expense. And this is actually something that one would predict if one were well-schooled in something called game theory. Now, I must say I'm a huge fan of game theory. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and so game theory is at the core of what I think about all the time. But I must say, if there's one subject that I think people would benefit greatly from studying, if you wanted to add something to the list of things that you were looking into, game theory would be at the top of the list. When I say game theory to people, though, I very often get a strange reaction. It has some kind of a bad stigma associated with it. And I think what goes on is the term game is confusing to people. When you hear about people's problems in civilization and you say, well, this is really a question of game theory, it sounds like you're trivializing the issue. So we either need to rename game theory or get over that stigma and realize that game theory, the meaning of the term game in this situation, is that this is about complex systems in which there is competition, in which there is winning and losing. And it describes all such systems. It describes living biological systems, it describes economic systems, it describes political systems, and therefore is at the core of all of these things that we're trying to sort out. And understanding the game theory of the social justice movement is, I think, essential if we are going to defeat it. So there are three kinds of players in the movement, and they are motivated to be there by three different things. There are the prime movers, which I described already. The prime movers are people who are actually advancing their own agenda and are most likely to be conscious of what they are doing. They get ahead through manipulation. Presumably they are the source of many of the linguistic traps and the policy proposals and the cost driving that allows the movement to function. The second group of people after the prime movers are the tools. So the tools in the movement are people who have signed up maybe because they've heard a soundbite about what sorts of values they are pursuing, and they haven't looked any more deeply into it, and they find themselves being bossed around and told how to serve the movement best. We saw a lot of this at Evergreen. Many of the people who were fighting for a sort of intersectional reversal of historical oppression were themselves white students. Now, you can understand this more deeply if you look into their own discussions about allyship. So we've all heard about allyship, and probably many of us in this room have a sort of a conflict within ourselves when we hear that term. I know that I certainly did. I regard myself as an ally of people who have been historically oppressed. It seems to me that that's the right thing to be, to understand that historical oppression has an implication in the present and that it carries obligations. On the other hand, in order to be an ally within the movement, one has to sign up for certain things that I was never going to sign up for, and probably most of you wouldn't either. So what are those things? Well, ally is one of these terms that's been redefined. Ally, if we speak in common parlance, is a term that connotes a symmetrical peer relationship. Two nations ally with each other. That doesn't put one in charge of the other. It means that they're teaming up for some sort of a common goal. That's not how it is inside this movement. Inside the movement, allyship is very definitely a subordinate relationship. I'm told that many of the students who came to protest me at my classroom, I knew none of these students, by the way. All of the students who showed up were brand new to me. Many of them apparently showed up not knowing why they were there to protest. They were told it was their obligation to the movement and that they should show up, and they were given a piece of paper that described things they were supposed to say. And I will say, many of them, I think, were confounded by actually talking to me because I wasn't the cartoon that they had been told I was. I'm an anti-racist, and they thought they were confronting a racist, and that was initially confusing to them. And when they discovered that little paradox, what happened is they went into a very automatic mode. Rather than come back and tell whoever had instructed them to show up at my class, hey, I think you got something wrong because that guy didn't sound like you told us he was going to sound, they went into some mode where they started chanting and they started reading from this piece of paper rather than have to confront what was actually in front of them. So it is this subordinate relationship, and in fact it gets even worse than subordinate. There is a discussion I ran into online in which there was a very explicit equivalency made between allyship and being an accomplice. The idea was that inherent to the job of the social justice movement was breaking the rules and breaking the law, and that if you were really committed to the values that the movement claims to be advancing, that your obligation, if you were not historically oppressed, was to break the law for them. That was the idea. Ally is an accomplice, and it is an accomplice that does what they're told. It is a subordinate accomplice. So I'm not exaggerating when I call these people tools. That's what they've become. That's what they've allowed themselves to become. Okay, the third group, the first two were the prime movers and the tools. The third group are the free agents. So these are people who are really opportunists. They don't need to sign up for this stuff, but they get ahead by doing so. And some of them are perfectly cynical. Some of them may be self-deluded. But there are many different types. At Evergreen, we had administrators who find themselves getting ahead by signing up for this muscular movement within the faculty and the students. To challenge them might be costly to one's career, but to simply sign up and advance their cause leaves you as an administrator much less likely to be targeted. So there's a duality to the role, because on the one hand, the social justice movement structures itself so that administrators will make this choice, and the administrators do so because many administrators are in fact cynical, self-promoting people. And so it's effectively a partnership between two cynical entities. You'll also find this amongst podcasters and journalists. So these people, by writing stories that flatter this viewpoint, get a ready-made readership or listenership. And if your well-being as a podcaster or a journalist comes from the fact that you've got a lot of eyes on your pieces, then standing out as somebody who is advancing this particular cause is a way to get ahead. And so they do it. And professors too, especially at Evergreen, there were a number of professors who took a lead in defending the strategic equity proposal, who were initially its target. So they were initially its target, and then they switched and they became aggressive advocates, and then they became allies to this movement, which I think these professors had identified as likely to win. And if this movement wins and it advances its professors into powerful roles on hiring committees, and it advances its proposals through the faculty governance structure, then those people who have been strong advocates during the process of ascent are likely to be brought along with it. Whereas if you're challenged, you're liable to fall by the wayside. Okay, so that gives you some sense of who the players are. Now I want to talk a little bit about the system that they bring along with them. I call it a hermetically sealed system. And you will probably, those of you who have faced these arguments, will have encountered the frustration of trying to challenge them logically and not being able to make any headway at all. And what I submit to you is that the reason you can't make headway is that there's essentially a flowchart in which every single argument you could conceivably make has been mapped. And if you make a new argument, then the closest thing on the map will be assumed to be the argument that you've made, and you will be shunted to the proper response to shut it down, right? There is no defeating this thing. And it's composed of several different kinds of components. So the first one is bad assumptions. There are bad assumptions that if you don't look at them too carefully might sound like they have some truth in them, but if you scrutinize them, you'll discover they don't. But once you've accepted them, what they cause you to conclude is some radically bizarre, upside-down universe. So here are some examples. Lived experience trumps population analysis, right? So population level analysis is what we would typically do in a scientific study. We would look at some sort of pattern and we'd say, is this pattern the result of some cause, like, for example, bias that exists inside the system? Well, if you take the assumption that lived experience is actually the only valid thing and that population level analysis is somehow incapable of recovering what it is that takes place in people's lives, well, then you will discover that all sorts of people have stories to tell about oppression that they've faced, which might well not stand up if it were scrutinized in some sort of rigorous, dispassionate way. So to give you a trivial example, you know, if, let's say a woman is walking down the street and, all right, let's make this personal. Let's say a woman is walking down the street and I am walking down the street in the other direction. And I look at her in a way that she finds uncomfortable. Well, she may have the sense that I have had some ill intent. Now, if she doesn't know that I've looked at the guy who followed her in exactly the same way, she is incapable of calibrating her experience. It's no failing of hers, it's just a failing of the anecdote. She's had one experience, but she has no idea, maybe I'm a guy who gives people awkward looks, right? Maybe it has nothing to do with her being female at all, but she's not in a position to know that because she's had one experience. So this is why, in fact, scientific analysis looks the way it does, because we are well aware that things can look very much like something, but when you analyze at a population level, you may discover that the cause is something very different. Also, I would point out that if you really do believe, as I do, that there are structural biases in our system that are important and have major consequences, the way to establish that is with a dispassionate analysis at the level of populations where you can see that there is a real consequence of some sort of process. So signing up for this bad assumption that lived experience is the only true insight is a terrible error. On the other hand, you can imagine that it is very empowering if you find yourself in a group that is historically oppressed and suddenly you're able to assert, this is what I have experienced, this is what it means, and this is what the natural remedy for it must be. All right, here's another one of these assumptions. Reasonable people cannot disagree. Now, they don't say this out loud, but this is certainly the implication of many things that they do say. So when you have the experience of making arguments and they have no impact on what's coming back from the other side, the point is the other side has already reached a conclusion and it believes that conclusion to be effectively perfect. And anybody who disagrees is disagreeing for some illegitimate reason. Maybe the person on the other side is cynical or there's some sort of conspiracy afoot or something like that. And I would point out, reasonable people disagreeing is an essential way for civilization to function, and that in fact this is a core biological feature of human beings. The way we all end up in civilization is that our ancestors figured out some pretty difficult problems, and they did it by disagreeing with each other, disagreeing in good faith so that they could discover what the real truth was. Another bad assumption is that inquiry itself is a bad thing. Now, I was shocked by this. I did not see this one coming. As a scientist, my feeling is that inquiry is a beautiful thing, and it reveals truths that are profound and important and have distinct implications for how we should run civilization. But during the protests, a student, somebody I should tell you, at Evergreen we teach programs that are full-time for both professors and students. So professors know their students much better than they would under standard circumstances. Student I know very well, somebody that my wife and I, on our study abroad program, traveled with in Ecuador for 11 weeks and spent a year in a program with her. A student who is half black was walking across our campus. She was walking to the science buildings, and she was confronted by protesters who challenged her and berated her for being black and studying science. Now, I must say, I can't believe I am standing at a podium telling that story. If I wake up in a half an hour and it turns out this is a dream, that will be the most likely reason that I would ever say such a thing into a microphone. The alternative is that it really happened and that this is a real room full of people who are assembled to hear such stories. It did happen. What we found out later, my wife and I, was that this was not the only incident, that in fact many students of color had been challenged for studying science at Evergreen. Inquiry is bad. If you are involved in inquiry, you are personally bad. You are betraying the values that the social justice warriors are pushing. I find that offensive, but nonetheless, it's a bad assumption on their list. Meritocracy is some kind of trap. So meritocracy is something that they are now challenging, that meritocracy is a trick, that it is designed to reinforce historical privilege, and that we must reject meritocracy, effectively accepting that what people do is inherently all of equal quality. This is obviously very dangerous to a society that depends on us innovating our way through puzzles. There's an assumption that one can simply swap out the people at the front of the room for other people, and that it will not have a negative consequence for students. So there is a campaign to hire people that, quote unquote, look like the people in the room. Now, if you think for a moment about what a proposal on a college campus to hire people that look like the students in the room means, it can't possibly mean anything. If the room is at all diverse, you can't hire the person that looks like the people in the chairs. But nonetheless, there's a desire to hire people at the front of the room who look like the people in the chairs, as if hiring from a narrow population isn't going to impact quality. Now, I'm not arguing that, for example, darker people are lower quality scholars. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that you want to hire from a large population because you are looking for people who have extraordinary capability. And you will find them. They are in the tails of the distribution. If you hire from a small population, you won't see many people in the tails of the distribution, so you won't be able to hire them. But nonetheless, the social justice warriors believe that it makes sense, that it is a worthy trade to simply change the skin color of the people at the front of the room to make people in the room more comfortable. The next bad assumption on their list is that discomfort is itself injury. That if you are uncomfortable, you have been harmed, and therefore that there is a right to purge uncomfortable things from the educational landscape. Now, this couldn't possibly be more dangerous to the educations of the people in the classroom if it tried. Discomfort is a sign that something that you think is right is being challenged. Now, maybe it's being challenged by something that is less right than what you thought, in which case that discomfort will be temporary and you will discover that your idea was stronger than you thought it was and your comfort will be restored. Or maybe you're going to discover that your discomfort is actually a sign that something you thought was true is actually false. Either way, you come out ahead. So if we accept this assumption and we bar discomfort from the classroom because it's a sign that we are harming people, then it is the death of education. That's really what it is. Education involves discomfort. This used to be openly said at Evergreen. I haven't heard it in a couple of years, but it used to be openly said that discomfort was the key to educating people, that was our job, was to take people out of their comfort zone. Next assumption is that anytime you find yourself on the defensive, your opponent has pulled a fast one, right? So there is an assumption that if somebody says something that causes a member of the social justice coalition to have to think about what the answer might be, that is inherently a sign of bad faith action of some kind, rather than a sign that there's something to be learned. And finally, a related point is there is an assumption that when your opponent makes gains, there has been a conspiracy. Now, we have to deal with this issue of conspiracy a little bit carefully because it is one of those third rail issues that divides every room. But the fact is, we all know conspiracies happen. There are real conspiracies, and we all know that many allegations of conspiracy are false. The difficulty is that conspiracy is a challenge to Occam's razor, which is the central principle to figuring out what is true. Conspiracies confound Occam's razor. They game Occam's razor. But I now find myself in a very funny position, which is because I have many friends left at Evergreen, on the faculty, amongst the students, and on the staff, I hear things about what's taking place on the campus. There's currently a conspiracy theory that involves me and why I was successful at surviving their challenge. And I know it's false. I can't necessarily convince anybody else of this, but the very fact that I'm in a position to say, well, actually, that conspiracy didn't happen, and I'm one of very few people who can say for sure that that's the case, is a very powerful position to be in. Nonetheless, to hear that conspiracy theory bubbling through the campus as an explanation for why they found themselves so embarrassed in the case of their protest against me is fascinating. So their assumption is, if you make gains against them, you have engaged in some kind of conspiracy. Okay, now these bad assumptions result in conclusions that are themselves false, and these conclusions are where the work actually happens. So the conclusions are what allows them to wield power. Let me give you some examples of some bad conclusions. One is, if you oppose an equity proposal, then you are against equity. Now, this was a major trap at Evergreen because there was a really bad equity proposal in motion, and if you cared about the college, you had to stand up and say so, and if you said so, then it was evidence of some major defect in your character. Another bad conclusion is that if you defend yourself against accusations of racism, you are evidencing racism. Now, this is a very clever little trap, which makes it impossible to know how to react. And the right thing to do in the face of such a thing, if you're simply trying to stay alive, is keep your thoughts to yourself. And the final one is that if you defend yourself against accusations of white supremacy, then actually you are hoping to preserve your own privilege. All right. At the end of this talk, what I'd hoped to do was to talk about two more synthetic ideas about where we are, what it means, and what we might do about it. The first one is something I call cultivated insecurity, and it is the idea that many people find themselves unable to stand up and say what needs to be said because of certain ways that society is presently structured. So, it is true that a tenured professor at a state college is in a pretty secure position relative to other places in society that one might find themselves. On the other hand, it is also true that a small number of things going wrong in one's relationship with one's employer suddenly puts a great many things in jeopardy simultaneously. So I knew this to be the case, and I was making this argument long before what happened at Evergreen had occurred. I was making it as an abstraction, but now I've lived through this episode, and I've felt it personally. So what goes wrong if you have a problem with your employer? Well, it jeopardizes your mortgage, it jeopardizes your retirement, it jeopardizes your health care. It jeopardizes your ability to continue to live in the same place. That's a lot of things to go wrong simultaneously. And the implication of this is that many people who appear to be fairly secure in their place in society actually have a reasonable fear of things going suddenly wrong and having a spectacular loss of security, and that keeps people in line who would otherwise stand up. Now, my contention is that this insecurity has in part, perhaps unconsciously, been cultivated by a political apparatus that would prefer that we do not challenge it. And so, in effect, those things that keep people relatively compliant because they're afraid of what happens if they stand up, those things have advanced. And I think what has happened is that the social justice movement has tapped into that very same mechanism. So the fact that the social justice movement can challenge a professor and cause them to have to leave the university is a very frightening fact for lots of people. And so what I experienced on the inside of Evergreen was tremendous support from people who refused to speak. And I mentioned this many times. I emailed my colleagues about it, and I said, We have a culture of fear on this campus, and I can't tell you how many people have approached me privately and they've told me they're supportive of what I'm saying and they hope I'll keep saying it, but they're not going to say anything themselves because they're afraid of what will happen. I can't even say that they're wrong. I mean, clearly they're right. So that culture of fear results in a number of things. It results in arguments that need to be made not being made. It results in those who are making arguments that need to be made being isolated, but maybe most disastrously, it results in a completely false impression to the outside world about where the preponderance of opinion is. It looks, if you look at Evergreen and you look at who says what, it looks like I was one of very few voices that disagreed with this equity proposal, which suggests that maybe there's something off about me. On the other hand, if you were capable of listening into the private conversations as well as the public conversations, you would understand that Evergreen was fiercely divided over the proposals that we're advancing. So it colors the narrative in a very dangerous way. And it results in what I would call an epidemic of cowardice. So we have an epidemic of cowardice in the university system. It's a mirror for the epidemic of cowardice that we have in our political system as well. And the important take-home lesson is that if you want to win this game, if you want the values that probably speak for all of us, the desire to see government that functions, to see it function to liberate people to achieve good things and to be free of fear of misfortune. If you want those things, the way to get there is to cultivate security for those who stand up. You want people who stand up. They're going to pay a price because those who are trying to incentivize bad policy will ensure that they do. But if you can engineer a mechanism that causes them to feel there's some other kind of security, they will stand up because in general, people are ready to say what needs to be said unless their peril is immediate and, frankly, unless it involves their families. All right, now a final point. As I mentioned before, I find myself in a very odd circumstance where, although I've been on the left for my whole life, I now find that many of the people who are most interested in talking to me are somewhere over on the right. And I've done a lot of thinking about what this means and what its implications are for us. And I want to give you a brief model that I think suggests something about where we should be headed. Many of you have probably taken what's called the political compass test. I want to be a little bit cautious about this. I cannot vouch for the political compass test's ability to place you on the map. But what I do want to defend is the two-axis model that it argues for when looking at political questions. So if you think in your mind of an x-axis and a y-axis, on the x-axis are left and right. Those are political left and right. On the y-axis are authoritarians on the top and libertarians on the bottom. So libertarian here does not mean economic libertarian. It means people who favor liberty as perhaps the highest human value. Now, the reason I raise this is because I'm ever more convinced that left and right are not particularly meaningful axes at this moment in history, and there's a reason for that. I find that I have very easy, comfortable conversations with libertarians on the right, in the bottom right-hand quadrant of that map. I am far over in the bottom left-hand quadrant of that map. I am a left libertarian. The fact that left libertarians and right libertarians get along easily owes to the fact that we have almost complete overlap in our values. If I, as a left libertarian, ask a right libertarian how they feel about a fair system, they favor it just as I do. And the reason that they favor it is quite clear. The reason they favor it is because a fair system works better. The more people who have access to the market, the more people who are capable of innovating and delivering things to the market, the better the market discovers new things that are valuable. So a true right libertarian favors a fair system, and a true left libertarian favors a fair system. Where we differ is over policy. Those on the left are traditionally a bit over-enthusiastic about meddling with a system in order to make it better, and they tend not to appreciate the full significance of the unintended consequences that tend to come along with policy. Those on the right tend to be a bit overly cautious about tinkering And so they will shoot down a proposal that might in fact be net beneficial because they fear the unintended consequences perhaps more than they need to. But in an era where nobody on left or right knows what policies we should be advocating, there's very little reason for these two quadrants to disagree. We agree on what a good society would look like. We may not agree on how fair society is presently, and we may not agree on the wisdom of tinkering, but we agree that fairness is a good thing. And the really important point is that we also agree that authoritarianism is a great danger. We should be united. Those of us on the libertarian left and the libertarian right should be united against authoritarianism in all its guises. Now, this actually provides a strategic advantage if we take it seriously. And the reason that it does is that the authoritarians on the authoritarian left and the authoritarians on the authoritarian right do not like each other at all. They don't get along, and they cannot team up. So, to win this battle, the right approach is to recognize the natural allegiance based in values of libertarians on the left and libertarians on the right, and to confront the authoritarians. Having won that battle, the proper thing to do will be to recognize that the solutions that have been embraced by libertarians on the right and libertarians on the left are all inadequate to the problems of the 21st century. Socialism isn't going to get us out of this. Libertarianism isn't going to get us out of this. We actually have to sit down with a fresh sheet of paper and start thinking about what kinds of solutions are adequate to the challenges we face. We need to recognize that the solutions that were proposed in the 18th and 19th centuries are, all of them, not aware of the danger that evolution in markets and in political structures poses to whatever solution making you would be tempted to engage in. That, on the one hand, might be a bit frightening because it suggests that nobody has the answers. But I would submit to you it also suggests that the possibility of a much better future might simply be a matter of confronting the question with fresh eyes. Thank you.
We'll break for another half hour.